Australian Air Force sent the RAAF Canberras to firstly operate at Butterworth in Malaysia in 1958. They stayed there for 9 years, and in April 1967, they first moved across to Phan Rang in Vietnam. The squadron was number 2 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, and it joined into 35th Tactical Fighter Wing of the 7th Air Force, US. And we found when we arrived in Phan Rang that there were other bombers there as well, similar to the Canberra. In fact, it was the American Mark B-57, which was operated by a number of squadrons. And so we were co-located at Phan Rang and virtually integrated into the United States Air Force tactical bombing system, which operated right across South Vietnam. Operational missions from Phan Rang were tasked by the United States Air Force tactical commanders, and the aircraft flew with 500 and 1,000-pound bombs in its bomb bay and one on each wingtip. We were tasked by the American authorities just as they tasked their own service people, and given a target area to proceed to. We would taxi out and take off, and in order to get anywhere, we had to use the tactical air navigation TAC air system, which was basically an electronic system where we were able to measure our bearing and distance from various TACAN stations around South Vietnam. And the whole of the US Air Force system used that TACAN system, and we always reported ourselves as being as 50 degrees or 050 degrees at 25 miles from a particular base. Excuse me. And we were under radar guidance as well from the ground, so they knew where we were all the time. So for an operation, we would head out to a target area generally, and when we arrived in the target area, we would be directed to go onto another frequency and talk to a forward air controller. The forward air controller was basically an American Air Force pilot who flew an O-1 Bird Dog light aircraft, and he would know his target area very well. Our aim was to provide close air support to the Army troops on the ground, and essentially we were controlled by the US military system, which was the US Army controlled. So the whole US Air Force virtually worked for the US Army in that context. So we would then come in, and the forward air controller would tell us where the target was, and we would call in, and generally we would meet up with him, and he would then point out the target to us. Once we're in touch with the FAC, he would tell us, generally we were flying at something like 15, 20,000 feet altitude. He would call us down to his altitude, and he'd be generally around about 2,000 to 3,000 feet above the ground, fairly safely above enemy ground fire. He would then give us a location where we would rendezvous, and he would then point out the geographical features of where the target was. And so quite often he would refer to various rivers or roads or items like that which we could identify, and so then work out where the target was, and then we'd have to count or determine what our bombing pattern would be, because we flew a level bombing pattern generally at 3,000 feet, and we would do what was like a circuit, a flying circuit, just as though we were landing at an airport, except we stayed at the same height. And so we would generally fly a pattern which enabled us to then line up on the target. Quite often it might be a canal, along a canal, or some straight point where we would have to line up. Other times it was just a spot target where we would have to locate the actual position, generally in reference to some sort of geographical feature, but quite often the FAC would fire out a smoke rocket from underneath his wings and mark the target. Sometimes they weren't that accurate, and he would not necessarily have us drop our bombs right on the smoke, but he might tell us to say, I want you to drop 100 meters under my smoke and 50 meters to the left or right, depending on the direction we were coming in. So that way he then taught us or told us how to take our aiming point, and we would then set up our pattern, which was the circuit pattern, and we would fly over the target, generally turn left because the pilot was on the left-hand side and wanted to see as much as he could. So we'd turn left, do a downwind leg, open the bomb bay doors, and I would crawl down the front and the nose, and we would set up the bombing situation. We would select which number of bombs we're going to drop, what sort of spacing would drop between the bombs, or we would drop them singly, depends, and we might do 6 runs, 6 or 8 runs and drop them singly. And we would come in and attack our target. The aircraft that were used in the tactical air bombing, being US Air Force, consisted of F-100 Super Sabre aircraft, with a couple of squadrons were based at Phan Rang, and then they were replaced or had additionally F-4E or F-4 Phantom aircraft that were also very good bombers. All these aircraft were dive bombers. They used to come in from a fairly high altitude and point them nose towards the target and drop their bombs, compared with us, who dropped on a straight and level attitude and just opening our bomb bays to drop our bombs. Quite often we'd have conflicts in the target area for a number of reasons. First of all, the Americans were coming from different parts of Vietnam to us, and consequently might have been on different frequencies talking to different stations as they came in. And so we could actually be in a bombing area where there are other aircraft that we didn't know about. And we didn't have any electronic warning gear or other gear to detect aircraft around. So we had to be very aware visually in order to avoid colliding with our friendly aircraft. In addition, we would have the B-52s coming into South Vietnam from outside, who were dropping their bombs from very high altitude, and we would have to be very careful that we didn't get impacted by their falling bombs. In fact, on the emergency frequency, a warning used to come out, and the B-52s were known as airborne artillery, and we would get an airborne artillery warning to say that there was going to be bombs dropping, and they would give this location, and it was either a location from a TACAM distance, or we had a grid map system to which they used, and they would give a grid position where the bombs were going to be dropped. And so we would avoid that and keep out of the way.